Okay, well, kia ora koutou te katoa, te hui mai nei. Welcome to this gathering of the International Association for Community Development, Oceania region. And I'm Cissy Rock, and I'm one of the trustees, and Michelle is another trustee. And I'm not entirely sure she's going to make it today because she is working where there's patchy Wi-Fi. And I'd like to start by acknowledgement. I know in Australia you do the acknowledgement to country, and I think it's important that whether we're in Australia or New Zealand, that we acknowledge whose land we are standing on, and the people who have gone before us, the people who are here now, and the leaders that will emerge. So just to take that moment to focus on the privileges that many of us have gained at the cost of others. So we're going to run a session today on queering community development, and Will is going to start, and we'll sort of do a little bit more of the history, and then we're going to hear from different panelists. Then we're going to go into breakout rooms and have a chat about what's been stimulated in us, and then we're going to feed that back so that the panelists can come and join in. So I said that this is a peer-to-peer situation, right? This isn't about expertise or teaching anyone anything about being queer or the LGBTI plus community. This is about a moment, I think a pretty special moment in time, where people are going to share some of their internal thoughts as sort of a generous gift for us to get stimulated and think about ourselves and our role in community development. And the thing that I thought was very special, I guess, about the LGBTI community, of which I am a part of, is a concept of solidarity. You know, like I've really experienced a lot of solidarity in this community of communities, and at times, when I think about my own intersectionality, I have been impressed with working from the margins, organising from the margins. So I think there's a lot to be got from an open discussion that will take about 60 minutes and is recorded. And it's great, I reckon. Introduce yourselves in the chat, but there will also be time in breakout rooms too. So I am going to hand over to Will, and I'm going to pin you so that you can take up a lot of the screen, and your 5 minutes starts now.
Thanks, Cissy. Kia ora, everybody. So nice to meet so many of you, see some familiar faces as well. I'm really pleased to be here. So my name's Will. I am currently in the last 2 months of my PhD looking at histories of queer activism in Aotearoa. So forgive me if I'm a bit discombobulated. I'm all over the show at the moment. So yeah, Cissy asked me if I could talk a little bit about histories of queer communities in Aotearoa. But I'm sure everybody here has so many experiences in that themselves. So this is just from my own perspective and studies. I guess at the start, I just think it's important that we start from understanding that it's colonization that brought homophobia, transphobia, queer oppression to Aotearoa. Amazing scholars like Dr. Elizabeth Kirikiri have established that before colonization, takatāpui, so Māori of diverse genders, sexualities, and sex characteristics, were, as Elizabeth says, simply part of the whānau, part of the family in Aotearoa. And understanding that because colonization isn't a thing of the past, but something that continues today, continues to structure our lives, that colonial attitudes around gender and sexuality continue to mean that queer communities are marginalized, but that this marginalization is not uniform, and that we also have lateral violence within our communities, racism, classism, transmisogyny, sexism, have always also been a part of our communities. So in saying all that, I also think it's important that we speak about queer communities in the plural, that there's no one single queer community, but multiple fluid intersecting queer communities. And it's also for that reason that I like to use the word queer when I'm doing history stuff, because for me, queer is a trans historian Morgan Page put it that queer is both stubbornly indivisible and capacious. I think I pronounced both of them right, but basically the idea that queer gestures to that multiplicity and names how all these different communities are materially interconnected. And I find that concept of being materially connected really important. I often like to say that there is no gay history or lesbian history without trans history, without bisexual history, intersex histories, other queer histories. When we gaze into our histories, we see that all these different communities, queer communities, were not always so well defined or so distinct from one another. In the 1960s in Aotearoa, a term that was often used by queer people was camp with a K. So historians like Chris Brickle and Wellbeings, Nahuia Ta'awakatuku have explored how people who also saw themselves as homosexual, queen, dyke, fairy, butch, and so on, some of these people also use the term camp. So to me, this signals that there's long been a sense of connectivity, collectivity between us. Also thinking about the fact that terms like butch or queen in the 1960s were less about gender identity than they were gender expression. So queen might be used equally by an effeminate gay man or a trans woman. Butch might be used by a masculine gay man or a masculine lesbian or trans man or any number of others. And that's thinking about, I guess, the 1960s in particular. That's where I started a lot of my research, because I think that we need to understand this period of time in order to understand movements like gay liberation, lesbian feminism that emerged in the 1970s afterwards. But for me, as a trans man, trans histories is my special focus. So what I guess I really want to share today is that trans people have always been a part of queer communities. Despite the wishes of some transphobes today who assert that we're not. But if you look into queer archives labeled lesbian or gay, you will always find trans individuals, references, whether that's references explicitly to transsexuals, transvestites, screaming queens, blatant gays, teased hair, painted nails, but you'll also find people who identified as trans at that time and people who didn't but came out as trans later. And for example, it's not uncommon when I speak to trans men who are older today, a lot of them have spent lots of time in lesbian communities in the past. So there's that element. And then I'm about ready to go time out. Cissy,
Yes, you
should I stop now?
It's right. Yeah, no, you finish off.
The last thing I was just going to say is that I've talked to so many amazing trans elders who have done so many amazing activist things, amazing community things. Like Sandy Gauntlet is someone I talked to who she single-handedly founded and ran the Rotorua Gay Liberation Front in 1973. So, our communities have these amazing histories. And lastly, just that when we think about trans past, there's a tendency to think about narratives of exclusion. But I think also it's important that we understand that we have these histories of solidarity, and that these narratives of us being together are also important if we're to move forward together, I think. So, yeah, that's all I'll say. Sorry, Cissy, I'm going over time a bit.
Thank you so much, Will. I think that you've managed to say a hell of a lot in a very small space of time, and I'm already got things that I want to talk to you about, so I'm sure other people will too. So I'm just gonna move the pin over to Lee, and their 5 minutes starts now.
Awesome. Thanks, Cissy. Yes, so my name's Lee. My pronouns are he, him. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of where I'm joining you from today, the Wurundjeri lands here in Naarm, Melbourne, and extend that acknowledgement to all of the First Nations people we've got here today, and also acknowledge our LGBTQI plus brother, boy and sister girl elders that have kind of paved the way for where we are today. And my screen's just gone off my phone for my notes. Perfect. So yeah, I grew up in a small little town in the northwest of the UK called Fleetwood. If you know the lozenges Fisherman's Friends, it's the only place in the world where they're made. So a little bit about me. I'm mostly going to say some things that are in direct conflict of one another today when I've started to consider my thoughts, just I think because of the complexity of queer community building, basically. So what does queer community building mean to me? Community co-creating and leading change together, I think, in a nutshell, and we've been doing it for years. You know, and it's come from a place of necessity, of fighting for equity and equality, and to be our kind of authentic selves. And that fight continues, you know, globally. I was at a conference the other week, and chatting to people from the forcibly displaced peoples network, and there's a pilot project where community being asked to come together to support community members coming over from other countries as well. So there's queer community building happening in lots of different spaces, and I think building on what Will said around the communities, we stand in solidarity, but we are communities, and sometimes having them conversations with people who maybe just see as an umbrella term can be pretty challenging. I certainly know working on an LGBT strategy and trying to have conversations, say, hey, different communities have different visions for their community. We're not just one homogenous kind of group of people. And while we've been organizing for years and fighting for change, there are people that are really, really new to this space, and are doing it from a place of passion. So what does queer community building mean in that space? In Gladstone, where I used to live, we set up a Pride festival at 5 events over 3 days. We're 7 hours from the nearest city, so a community within a community that has never done community development work trying to create change. What does that kind of look like? And also thinking, my last kind of thought bubble was, I know in Queensland, while I was over there are only 3 organisations with a sole purpose to work with LGBT community that have paid staff. That means the rest of the sector is community building. We are community building. And I maybe leave on a quote from what I heard my friend Baz say the other day in a talk he was doing. And he works for an organisation called Queer Arabs Australia. And none of us are free until all of us are free. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you, Lee. Yeah, I thought that was really, I just loved that reminder about, you know, sometimes people are new, you know, like, so we say, oh, we've been doing this work for years, but yeah, there's always new people coming into our community as well, right? And what does that mean for them? So yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up. I'm gonna replace the pin with Toad and Guy, and we'll hear more from you soon, I'm sure. Thank you, Lee. Your 7 minutes, because there's 2 of them, starts now.
Thank you, Cissy. Kia ora koutou katoa, everybody. Ko Kai Taku Ingoa. I'm calling in from beautiful rainforest skippable country here in northern New South Wales. The sun is shining delightfully, and we're here on a 136 fairy queer community. So we've been delighted at just having a recent gathering with our extended community across the world. I'm a proud Takatapu Māori from Ngāti Toa Rangatira, Ngāti Kahungunu, Ngāti Koata. And I thank you all for what you've shared before about place and community and the challenges within our own communities within communities. And Tōnai from a practice of, I guess, queer communing around social ecology, so permaqueer based in Te Tai, how we relate to our landscape and how we understand our relationship to place as a historically marginalized and displaced people. So I guess there's an entwinement between what queer ecology is and what our sense of belonging looks like in not just a trying and testing social ecology, but also a trying and testing physical ecology. We're in a time of climate collapse. And what does that mean being under a world of tension and stress and systems failure? And what does it look like? And I think it looks like recognizing all of the systems that have got us here, and that we're beholding from communities who have been historically persecuted for choosing a different way of being. And so I feel endlessly grateful at the challenge of, trying to push through this place that we currently are at, but entirely qualified to challenge where do we go and what do we go. We're among people who have, despite every system and structure and norm around them, decided I will continue to be what I feel is right. And that is the time that we're in. And I think we can no longer separate person from ecology as we, hemorrhage towards the planetary boundaries, both locally and globally. What does it look like to take that same fierceness of self-determination, tino rangatiratanga, of queerness, of we will do the right thing by our people for who we are, and extend our people to the more than human realms beyond us? And in all of the climate movements and all of the ecological movements, I just am surrounded by queer community, and I don't believe that's at all a surprise. And I think there is liberation for us to continue to understand what is our role in solidarity towards tangata whenua, what is our role in solidarity towards the global Indigenous First Nations community, and where that intersects with queerness as well. And I think, Cissy, you spoke about we're good at solidarity, and how do we continue to take those next steps? And I think there's a real piece of empowerment here for us in stepping into that self-determination. But I'll pass you to, because that's...
Thank you, Guy. Oh, you can see my little we're got a little timer on to make sure we're not talking over each other. Yeah, thank you. And just to kind of speak to that concept as well, for me, it's like there's this aspect of building like community development for queer people, but then what does it actually mean to queer community development? And one of the things that's really kind of what my work and what I find deeply passionate about is how do we queer these structures that we live with under? And I also don't think we can separate that language from decolonizing. I think that these things are inherently linked because, as Will mentioned before, it was colonial forces that brought homophobia, transphobia, queerphobia to these spaces. I'm often inspired by a quote by Hannah Breckbill that says, and I'm paraphrasing her here, but she describes queering as the act of interrogating social norms and building new systems and relationships for the better, to meet the needs of all. So I often hear queer theory existing as a critique of heteronormativity. And I think that when it exists solely as a critique to something else, it means that it only echoes one people's experience. For me, queering is often, it's the art, culture, ways of living, the being visible and trying to make beauty and life and survive amongst a society that tries to invisible us. So I often think in terms of like queer theory and queering is for everyone in the same way that feminism lies the liberation of women and femmes, but applies to everyone. So too does queering and queer theory lies to the heart and liberation of queer people, but applies to everyone. So I think it's one of those really, really interesting things of like, how do we address these systems and not accidentally fall into assimilationist traps? I think that there's a real risk at times in a lot of spaces to try to apply these silos and these homogenizing approaches to just have these broad scale approaches that collapses the complexity of our very diverse communities into these kinds of very easy, reducing us down to kind of a neoliberal identity rather than a complex intersection of experiences. And And so I think that like this idea of queering, it has to be relational. I get really nerdy, and this is a really intense time thing to try to talk about all these things. But for me, it's like in all my nerdiness, apply queer theory in a systems thinking perspective of like a system is the elements, the relationships, and the function of a system that makes a system. And for me, queer theory is not just looking at the individual, it's looking at the relationships. How do we move beyond the self as just self? Queerness, for me, is more than just the same-sex attraction or gender expression. Queerness is cultural, personal, contextual. What it looks like communally is like so
Creative.
different. And I am out of time, so I'm going to hand over. But queerness is something that can't be pinned down. It's liminal by nature and it shifts. And so in our approaches, we have to consider that as well.
I love this idea of what assimilationist traps.
Mm.
You know, the neoliberal construct of the rainbow community. Yeah. So I think you're really, well, you're exciting me with what you're saying. So I imagine the breakout room discussion is going to be fantastic. Thank you both so much. We're going to finish. I'm going to find Betty, and we're going to hear 5 minutes from Betty, and then we're all going to start discussing stuff together. So I'm really looking forward to that. Betty, your 5 minutes starts now.
Kia ora everyone, and just want to acknowledge all those that have spoken before me. Like, awesome, you've said it. You know what I mean? And I'm Samoan. I'm a Samoan ancestry. I live in Aotearoa. I'm a lesbian. I am an activist. I'm a mother. You know, like I suppose when we're talking about how to, you know, in terms of what does queering community development mean to me, I eat, sleep, and you know, and live this. This is it. This is it. This is it. And actually, you know, it's about me. When I think about any of the work that I do with, you know, the decult space, the living in Aotearoa as a Samoan, being a lesbian in my family, you know, like. It's not like I sit there and I go, you know, people usually say to me, you know, Betty, you're so closet. And I'm thinking, closet? What am I closet about? Yeah, you don't get up and say, oh, you know, I'm Betty and I'm a lesbian. I says, oh, when do you get up and, you know, I'm straight? You know, like, you know, so it's that stuff about actually, it's not something that I sit and think about and actually wonder about how do I talk about it, how do I bring it out? It actually becomes part of the everyday conversation. It's about being honest about who we are. It's about being honest about challenging the discrimination, the, you know, all the isms, all those things apart. And so, like, you know, when I think about kind of which part of me is which, I can't do that. You know, this is it, and actually this is how we live it. This is how I speak it, and I find it quite easy to speak. It doesn't matter where I am and what kind of spaces. It's about just being able to speak about who I am and feel okay about it. And in terms of actually what that means, and you know, like I can't do this. I can't go into a space. Like when I talk about my activism, I do talk about actually being Samoan and Aotearoa. Yes, I am a Pacific Islander. Yes, we have connections. But actually, our being here actually has been off the backs of our cousins here, and actually, you know, and that's not recognised. And sometimes it's used as an excuse not to even actually have to talk about it. Or so when I think about being in the space of being queer, you know, our kids call themselves queer. Our kids are queer. That's how they. And I thought that was quite interesting when I used to think queer. Okay, it's interesting because you know, and it's about being different or being the same, or it's not actually in regards to their sexuality, and though it is. But I find I'm learning all the time, and I sit here in the space of actually learning more, in the space of actually just sharing. So anyway, I don't have, I'm more of a kind of have a conversation about it and bounce off what other people are saying. I'm not really you know, and I'd like to kind of end there for a bit. But kia ora, everyone. Kia ora, Cissy. Thank you for bringing us together.
Thank you, Betty. I was thinking a lot about what you were saying about how actually just being you is that queering, you know, like being in community development and doing as queer people is queering community development. You can't sort of say it's only my hand that's queer, the rest of me is something else. Yeah, and I you know, particularly like the idea that we're going to get into breakout rooms now and have a damn good chat with each other. And I just before we do that, I kind of want to say something about you know, there might be queer people here, allies here, you know, that we're all talking about this from good hearts, and that if we're a bit clumsy, sometimes I'm a bit clumsy, you know, to know that the goodness is there, and not to not speak because you're worried about being clumsy, you know. Speaking is where we learn. Like, how, if we don't have the conversations, how do we expand ourselves or our understandings of each other? So I thought I'm going to put all of us into breakout rooms, and it's 2:30 exactly, so maybe we spend 15 minutes having a chat in the breakout room, and then come back and share that another 15 minutes to share with each other. Hello, welcome back, everyone. I don't know about you, but we had a very abrupt ending to our conversation. Hi, Dee.
Oh, hi, Dee.
Yeah, Dee's just joined us. That's great. So we've got 14 minutes left just to bring ourselves back into a group and have some conversation. I'll start then with one thing. I was curious about the role that queer people play in community movements, community building, and was asking whether it was proportionally higher, you know. And Betty, you said something that you talked about your experiences, which I think would be good to hear here about leadership.
Most of the movements I've been of, my experience has been that they've been led by queers, you know, and I've often wondered whether that's just something that's just happened, but actually it is just the way it is, and actually most if not all movements and networks that I've been part of.
Yeah, Ellie's.
So when I say those movements, I'm talking about like Black women's movements, and you know the different nuclear movements, community development movements, you know, like and yeah, that's been my experience. So
yeah. Does anyone want to jump in on that?
Proud of that too.
I love that. Sorry, I shouldn't have come across that. You're very proud of that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does anyone want to jump in the conversation and add something more?
Yeah. What comes to mind when you say that is the you know, nothing about us without us. And I think we do need to be a little bit critical of like, why are these people with these lived experiences constantly leading it? And should that be reflected in perhaps more support or structural understanding or communication about how this lived experience utterly qualifies these people to be able to lead? Because, you know, the cracks of the system are most explicitly understood by those who live within them. And so how do we, you know, offer and support all marginalities that sit in that place? You know, queer people, definitely intersectional queer people have that lived experience. And I think every community is queer in some way. And so how do we recognize that edge that maybe isn't privileged in the current system that we have? And how do we offer and support that? And, you know, that will look different everywhere.
Yeah, something I'd love to throw into that pot as well is many queer people were not raised by explicitly queer people themselves. So much of our community organizing has had to be kind of cross-cultural, cross-age. We've got, I want to say that, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I find that queer folk are often, who are involved in movements, very good at being able to connect with unlikely allies, to make connections, to be able to do that kind of community organizing work, because they've often had to do it for their own sense of security to find their own communities, so to say. That this is kind of weird, able to kind of slip between those spaces.
I love that term, unlikely allies. Yeah. Anyone else want to add to that? Anything extra to say? Yeah, go for it. Is that you, Caro?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Cissy. In our small group, once Dee joined us, she was talking about a session that Dee and Lee, and again, loving the alliteration, Dee and Lee have developed and presented, and the incorporation of a trauma-informed element to that. And my question about that and my curiosity there is how did you guys know, maybe Lee, I think Dee's throwing you, how did you know that that was, and maybe that's self-evident to many people on this call, but how did you know that a trauma-informed perspective would be an essential element of the work that you were doing? And is there anything else that you need to say to that to frame that in a more useful way for everybody on the call?
Yeah, thanks, Caro. I think twofold. One is the lived experience and knowing full well that the trauma that you can live through as a queer person, and that can be on a daily basis for some people. You think of heteronormative systems where you can't put your pronouns in and all this, and that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. But I also think for me, the realization came where there is within the community, we have power and privilege, that's dispersed really differently, and not everybody kind of has that worldview as well. So it's around making sure that everyone is aware around intersectionality and trauma and how that builds into queer community building. So we say an education piece as well, really, for how we can do good work. I hope that answered the question.
Anyone want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll add one little piece
Yeah.
to that is that, and Lee and I have only just started talking about this last week, that because one of the other workshops that we deliver is trauma-informed community building, and it has vicarious trauma is part of that. And so that's the other kind of piece, of that trauma-informed work to consider when we are working alongside communities. And knowing that vicarious trauma, sometimes people don't even know they have it until it hits. So I think that's, really important to have that awareness going into work like this, to have that awareness so you can be very intentional.
You just really quickly, and that's a great point, Dee. If I think back to when we were in my previous role doing the engagement for Queensland's whole of government LGBT strategy, it was a queer team that was delivering that. And so going through and listening and hearing the stories that informed, we had to be really intentional around how we did that work to make sure that we were managing that vicarious trauma.
And Toad, you had a little click there.
Yeah, thank you. This is just something I feel really passionate about. We use the window of tolerance as a model that we teach to queer communities, and we apply in our own context. And one of the reasons that it's really important in these spaces is that when we're working with people who are outside of the window of tolerance, we know that they're inherently geared towards short-term thinking, competition, hierarchy. And there's that kind of Audre Lorde quote, the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. And when we're working with communities who are marginalized or experiencing trauma, but even within ourselves as community organizers, when we are consistently outside of the window of tolerance, our nervous system is geared towards using those familiar tools of those systems of violence, even if we wrap it up in progressive language. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there.
And I also want to add as well, like whenua aspect of this, of like from here on out, the stress of our landscape is going to exacerbate every single nervous system. And that's just a fact. And so we need to be as equipped as we possibly can to sense where that nervous system is at and give them the tools and equip the entire community with systems and structures, because it's one thing to be in volatile social situations, and now we're adding a landscape overlay to that. So, you know, what does it mean for us to care as best we can through that process? And that's recognizing at the core of us is that nervous system that senses everything around us. It's not just communication or behavior, but the sun, the moon, the stars, and everything else.
I know we're getting close to wrapping up, but Will, you mentioned something about being materially linked. Can you just flesh that out just a little bit?
Well, I guess by that I mean, like, when I'm thinking about queer histories, I'm thinking about the fact that, well, I guess because I'm coming from the perspective of like trans histories and kind of speaking back to histories that have not talked about trans people at all. I'm kind of like trying to emphasize the fact that trans people have always been a part of queer communities in a very like real way, like that trans people have just simply always been there. Whereas I guess I see I guess backlash of people saying, you know, that the people weren't really trans back then, or it's a trend, or it's a new thing, or you're just trying to say that trans people were a part of things uh, in a more abstract way. But I'm trying to, I guess, say no, trans people were there. The other historians maybe just haven't picked those details up, I suppose, or like I said before, thinking about people who maybe didn't even identify as trans at the time, they were still trans. They just weren't out as trans. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Mm.
yeah, thinking, I guess, yeah, about all of those things, I suppose, if that makes sense.
I think the thing that I found very interesting about today is this rub around kind of being queer in community development, you know, so the things that make queer people feel visible, the role queer people have played in community building, I wrote down here that well, I like this idea of the unlikely allies, but I was thinking about the kinship that happens, like just from my own personal experience, you know, I used to sit in a room and kind of check out, oh, who else here might be family, you know, and there's a kinship there, an unspoken backing of each other. So there's a being queer in community development, and then this idea that I think you've illuminated more, particularly Toad and Guy, around queering systems. So, you know, this idea of interrogating social norms. If queering is interrogating social norms, how do we do that, you know, in communities, in systems? And so they kind of sound the same, but I think they hum from different parts of the songbook or something. So I think it's been very rich and a great way for me to spend a Friday afternoon, and for some of you to spend your Friday lunchtime. But none of it would have been possible without you know, our 5 fantastic people sharing their internal thinking, their experiences with us. So you know, let's just do an old-fashioned, no, not, what's this? The hipsters do this for Betty and Will and Lee and Toad and Guy, you know. Kia ora, thank you so much for your time, and for all of you to be here with us, being part of the conversation. I so believe in the ripple effect. We'll go back and we'll talk to someone who'll talk to someone, so this conversation will go much further than those of us on the Zoom. So over and out from Cissy Rock, Trustee from the International Association of Community Development. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank
See
you.
you
Thank
later.
you.
Bye.